the teaching is particularly interested in focusing on happiness in daily living. And it complements the esoteric non-dual teachings, because at the end of the day, a realization of self actually is not there just so that there's a realization of self, but for what it delivers in practical daily living. And the explanations, when we look for them, about what liberation and realization will deliver, the Buddha actually gave the most simple to understand. Enlightenment is the end of suffering. And so in practical terms, in daily living, that's what we can expect. It's not about receiving all sorts of special powers. It's not about being in a state of bliss, not about getting everything we want, but rather finding ourselves living life ordinarily as an ordinary human being, doing in each moment what we need to do in order to live in the circumstance we find ourselves in, receiving consequences and outcomes that we're not in control of, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, but finding ourselves in a state of peace, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the outcomes. And peace really means the absence of suffering. And suffering in practical terms is an internal resistance that we often find when things don't go our way, when others don't behave the way we would like them to, and when we behave a certain way that we tend to judge. So suffering in practical terms, which is our unhappiness, arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So happiness really for the human being is living life ordinarily, but finding those attitudes to life not being present. So if that's what realization delivers, the end of suffering, and suffering is guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation in practical terms, then it's worth investigating on what basis do those reactions to life arise. So it's sort of approaching the matter from a different perspective, a different angle. So that's the starting point. What are we really looking for in life? So that was an explanation of what some of the teachings will tell us are available in life, is available if this transformation happens, the end of suffering. But what is the human being actually looking for? And whether we know it or not, we're looking for the same thing. We're looking to live life in a way where there is continuous unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. But it seems like we haven't realized that that's what we're looking for. Because if we look around us, it seems like everyone's got a formula that says my happiness, what I'm really looking for, is circumstantial. What I'm really looking for is outcomes. And whole lives are lived with huge amounts of energy being put into achieving something in the future with the expectation that it will deliver what I'm really looking for. Just check that everything's working here. Okay. And so these teachings actually, they're just concepts. All teachings are concepts. No teacher in all of history has ever delivered truth. And that's very important for us to understand what that means and therefore relate to the teachings correctly, because if we don't, what's likely to happen is we'll relate to teachings like we've related to most or to all concepts that we've received in our life. And that is, think that they are truth and then hold on to what it says rigidly, and that attitude towards concepts actually keeps us disconnected from who we really are, and is what keeps this attitude that suffering arises from in place. So what it means is, don't believe anything that's said, just use the pointings the teachings as pointings as to what to look at, so that we can investigate this for ourselves. And investigate it for ourselves means what? It means as we go through life, moment after moment, doing our daily living, we have the opportunity to see whether what the concepts say are true, whether what the concepts say are accurate. And as we verify the concept for ourselves, which means look at daily life and see whether the concepts are accurate, as we verify that they are accurate, then the concepts shift from being an intellectual understanding, and it becomes a deeper understanding in ourselves, until such time that the intellectual understanding becomes total. And when the intellectual understanding is total, then we find ourselves moving through life, not having to think about any of the concepts, because they actually are, it's not that they've become part of who we are. What the concepts have done, they've uprooted the false beliefs that were in place previously, false beliefs about who we are and what we need. They've uprooted those, and a more natural way of being is allowed to function in the absence of those false beliefs. So if what we're looking for is happiness for the human being, and happiness for the human being turns out not to be circumstantial, not to be pleasure in the flow of life, but rather peace of mind regardless of circumstance. Let's look at the basis of the suffering, which is the absence of our peace of mind. So in practical terms, the suffering arises in two groups. We'll address one at a time. First three in the first group is guilt, blame, and pride. Guilt is a judgment to actions that have happened through us, that have delivered pain to ourselves or the other. Not something we wanted, something that happened, and we feel guilty for having done what we did that delivered pain to the other. And the basis of that guilt is the belief that I am the one that chose to act the way I acted, and that I could have acted differently. If that belief isn't there, then guilt can't arise. But if the belief is there, guilt has to arise. If the belief that I am the doer and I could have done it differently, I could have delivered a different outcome, and I failed to do that because I, as the doer, chose incorrectly. And we'll find that it's that belief of personal doership that is the ground of not only guilt, but blame and pride. Pride is the same as guilt, however, in relation to outcomes that are positive, whereby we believe I am the doer, look what I have achieved because of my actions. And blame, based on the same principle of personal doership, says, you delivered pain, you the other has delivered pain to me, and pain is what I believe my unhappiness is. So that is an attack on what I'm really looking for, an attack on who I am. You hurt me, so I hate you. And we find that it's this guilt, blame, and pride, which ultimately at the base of it is an uncomfortableness with the other and oneself. And even an uncomfortableness with the other turns out to be an uncomfortableness with oneself. And it's that uncomfortableness with oneself that is suffering and is what disturbs the peace in the present moment. So we find that our unhappiness in life is always attitudinal, meaning our unhappiness is not the circumstance itself. It's not the pleasure or pain in the circumstance, not the pleasure or pain that has happened through my actions or the other actions, but rather our attitude to the pleasure or pain, our attitude to what has happened. And it's for that reason that it's possible for there to be continuous unbroken peace of mind in daily living, because it's not circumstantial. Our happiness is not circumstantial. If our happiness was circumstantial, the bottom line is that we can't be always happy in life, because the flow of life is never going to be pleasure, 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 pleasure. The nature of life is pleasure sometimes, pain at other times, not in our control. Clearly, that hasn't been understood by us humans, because nonetheless, what we try to do time and time again, day after day, is try to control life in such a way that we get pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And when life doesn't deliver pleasure, 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 due to nature or the actions of the other, we resist it as if something has gone wrong. We react as if the universe isn't working in that moment. Whereas in fact the universe is in perfect functioning order. So the second group of sufferings, which is our unhappiness, is worry and anxiety, and attachment to outcomes and expectation. And that is based on the belief, the ingrained belief, that who I am is more complete when there is pleasure delivered to me and less complete when there is pain. And so with that idea of who we are, we become attached to pleasure and pain, attached to pleasure being there and insisting that pain isn't there. And worry and anxiety is a form of worrying about things that may or may not happen in the future. And sometimes it's a feeling whereby we're convinced that something terrible has already happened and we're simply waiting to hear about it. And expectation and attachment to outcomes is a way of functioning whereby we're continually waiting for something to happen in the future, trying to achieve things in the future, with the understanding that when that happens, everything will be okay. So in 5 or 10 minutes, that was a description in pretty simple English terminology about all of human unhappiness. And at the beginning of that description was a concept that said what we're really looking for is happiness for the human, which turns out not to be pleasure or circumstantial, but rather the absence of suffering. So hopefully the concepts can be understood intellectually, which means intellectually what I said makes sense. How spiritual teachings and life tends to work is that the concept will start off intellectually understood and will become part of our up-to-date conditioning. And how it is received by the body and how it becomes integrated into our up-to-date conditioning is not in our control. But if it does get received and become part of our up-to-date conditioning, then what we'll find is that it will start to create effects. In fact, our suffering and everything that happens through the human being in each moment works on the same principle I just described, which is that the human being in each moment is in large part, or at least the vehicle part, is a biological instrument, a very beautiful, intricate biological instrument that has a genetic structure and which has been programmed by life from the moment that conception happens. So in each moment, the human being is exactly the way that they've been designed according to these two factors, their genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the human wasn't in control of their genes and not in control of how life conditioned them moment after moment after moment. And so the suffering that arises as a result of life being the way it is an automatic response that happens according to the human's makeup in that particular moment, not something which is optional at that particular moment. It's going to arise exactly the way it arises. And so what I'm describing here is something for us to investigate, once again, a concept that we have to verify for ourselves. See if there's a third factor. Let's see if there's a factor that makes the human being who they are in that moment and affects the way that they act, behave, speak, feel. Let's see if there's a third factor other than genes and up-to-date conditioning. The fact is that teachings have been pointing at this for a long time, and I've investigated it very intently for myself and haven't found a third factor. And when we do investigate it and find that in each moment the human being acts based on the way they're designed in that moment, it starts to undermine the very principle on which the first three suffering groups that I mentioned arise. Guilt, blame, pride, all based on the belief that I am the doer, that the other is the doer, and that I have full autonomy and control over what happens through me and the outcome. A complete fantasy when we compare it to the reality of how life unfolds. Meaning a complete error about who we are, a complete error about who the other is, a complete error about what life is. This is great news because all of the suffering arises from that error. It's another of the reasons why suffering is something that can completely dissolve, a reason why the human being can live life with the complete absence of suffering. How does it happen? It happens when life, in the same way that life inserted the error as part of the up-to-date conditioning of the human, it happens as life undoes that error. And once the error is undone, the basis on which the suffering arises is no longer there, and the suffering simply can't happen. So if you don't mind, even though I can hear you, you had a question, no? Yeah? So this is being streamed, so if you can speak into the microphone, even though I can hear you, that would be great. You just press the button to get the green light on.
Okay, so you say that we remove this. Well, basically the question is, I, the thinker, thinks that I can change this action or the outcome. So how do you stop believing that I, the thinker, can change this?
Very good. So what we really need to look at is who is the thinker, or what is the thinker? Because as part of the conditioning that life has put in place, there is the belief in a thinker. And the belief in a thinker is actually just a belief produced by the brain, which is part of the biological instrument. So what we find is there is no thinker, there's just a biological instrument that produces thoughts. And the idea that there is a thinker is contained in the thoughts produced by the biological instrument. So how do those thoughts change? How does the thought that I am a thinker and an actor that is in control of what I think and do, how do they change? And the answer is really quite simple. Life put in the false idea that I am the thinker and the actor through the up-to-date conditioning that life delivered moment after moment. And life puts in new concepts that dissolve the old beliefs. So it's life that changes the programming of the brain so that it doesn't produce the same mistake that it did originally. And how does life do that? One of the ways is puts us in situations like this. So I am just a biological instrument designed to speak and act exactly the way I speak and act in each moment, not in my control. I can only do it one way, the way that it happens. And the information that comes out is life's way of delivering new conditioning. Not just words that come out of me, but words that come out of everyone in every moment is new conditioning for whoever comes into contact with those actions or words. So life is continually reconditioning us. But when life puts us in situations where we're exposed to concepts that are specifically aimed and talking about human happiness, then that's when the body-mind instrument is likely to be reconditioned in such a way that suffering changes. But the concepts come out and they're new conditioning, but how they affect you and me are not in our control.
A follow-up question then is, I had a discussion yesterday with a friend and we came to the question of there's something that pulls me here to Arunachala that feels like it's beyond my desire or my will in a way. I can't go anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And in non-duality, I guess when we describe it romantically as this, it's the self longing for itself or something. And then in your explanation, would this just be the genes and up-to-date conditioning pulling itself in this direction, or is it that something calling or longing home? Like, what is that in?
Sure. So, so far, if you're listening to what I'm saying, you might be thinking, oh, this is a little bit scientific, a bit dry. This is not exactly the nature of life that I've come to know when going through spiritual searches and my own experiences that feel very profound and divine. And there's a reason why this is one way of presenting things, because it allows us to investigate for ourselves whether these concepts are accurate. The other way of presenting it is that life is a story, life is a creation that has been created by consciousness. Life is an experience arising in consciousness. And the whole of time was created in an instant before time came into existence. The whole of the creation that we know as the story of this universe was spontaneously created, and in effect, from the perspective of the human being that is intrinsically one with the creation, everything that is happening is completely predetermined to unfold exactly according to the creation, the story of life, which is effectively a dream arising in consciousness. A dream arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, recognized by consciousness. And that means that the content of life experience is able to be very multidimensional, to be exactly the way it's been created to be. So we can say that you are drawn here, you have a feeling one day that says, I want to go to Arunachala. And we could say that that's based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's a valid explanation from a causal point of view. That means that you've read some books, you've been here before, which means part of your up-to-date conditioning, and it is something that you like. It's become one of your biological preferences to be in this energy, and at some point the thought arises, I'd like to go back, or a feeling arises that then inspires the thought, I want to go to Arunachala, which then inspires the booking of the ticket. That's the causal explanation. Ultimately, the explanation is that it's all happening according to God's will. And God, I don't mean some external entity that's looking down, controlling, but God meaning source that has turned into the manifestation. Regardless of which way we look at it, we find that from the perspective of the human being, what I do is not ultimately my doing, but a happening according to God's will, or if we prefer, according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we had no control over. Now, the sense of personal doership can't stand to hear this. The sense of personal doership is effectively an entity that believes it is the thinker, it is the doer, it is the one that controls, it is the one that needs happiness through pleasure, and it is the one that will one day get it. So these concepts are a complete assault on this fictitious entity, which is actually a whole set of beliefs. Complete assault on that belief set. And so whether the reaction to these beliefs is one of uncomfortableness, or whether it's one of relief, is once again a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, or God's will. So we will find ourselves responding to the concepts one way, the way we do, and we had no control over that response to the concepts. If the sense of personal doership is really strong, then these concepts usually are unpalatable, and there'll be all sorts of reasons and excuses as to why they are not right, and some sort of justification to move away from them. If the sense of personal doership is not that strong, then the words will start to resonate on a level of self. A self that knows it's not the doer and knows that the purpose of life is not to control life. A self that knows that actually the purpose of life is to be happy. And it knows that happiness is not about getting anywhere or receiving and achieving anything. And so then that part of us that hears it is open and willing to hear more, which means that the concepts continue to become part of the up-to-date conditioning. Obviously, if someone is forced to leave, which is, that's not problematic, it just means it's destiny in that moment, it's part of the story of life for it to be there, then that person is no longer exposed to the concepts, and the concepts then aren't going to have a follow-on effect. Although what has been heard, even though they might not like it, may still become part of their up-to-date conditioning. And for the next 2 months, that person might have these thoughts going round and round in their head that they just don't want to have. The thought that everything is predetermined, that I'm not the doer, that I'm not in control of outcomes, but that's not such a problem because outcomes is not what essentially is going to deliver you happiness.
So this self that you talk about and then that recognizes this and actually takes it in. So what is that? That sounds like something else than the doer.
Yeah. So then we have the concept we were talking about yesterday, the working mind and the thinking mind, or the working brain and the thinking brain. The thinking, I'll stick with mind. The thinking mind is the part of the brain that has been conditioned in such a way that has these false beliefs of who we are. The working mind is the functional part of the mind that calculates what's needed, and it's needed in order for daily life to carry on, and it has no effect on our unhappiness. It's the part that understands language, the part of the mind that can calculate things, the part of the mind that can communicate with others, and it doesn't disturb our peace of mind. And so what we can find is that the concepts are received by the working mind. And so the working mind understands them, and it's a resonance in the overall system that receives or that resonates with the words. So it isn't actually. So the human being is not just the biological that I've been speaking about. So the human being is a combination of impersonal consciousness of source that has linked to a biological instrument and is functioning through that biological instrument. So the impersonal consciousness of source, the one impersonal consciousness of source, is linked to all human beings and functioning through the specifically designed instruments as personal consciousness. So the part of the human being that talks and thinks and feels, that's all mechanical. The part of the human that is aware and has the sense of existence is not mechanical. That is what's referred to as self. And those two characteristics, awareness and being, are the two primary functions of consciousness. So consciousness of source, impersonal consciousness of source, has two primary aspects to it. Awareness and the sense of being. And when that comes together, those two come together, the biological and the awareness of, or the consciousness of source, it's the combination of the two that make the person. And so the resonance then is a resonance of the working mind and the consciousness. So you can say it is the person as a whole that resonates with something, and that's going to be heavily dependent on the conditioning of the working and the thinking mind within that person. It's always nicer in the end to look at the more mystical side rather than the causal, which is that life is an amazing experience, and resonance is an experience in the moment that is unexplainable, is something that just arises. So from the other perspective, that everything is arising in consciousness, there's no question about genes and up-to-date conditioning and brains. Because show me the brain. Where is the brain? When we're present in the present moment and aware of everything as a spontaneous arising in consciousness, causality is not the reason. Everything is spontaneously arising in one moment, collapsing, and then re-arising, collapsing. And so causality is not real, it's just apparent. But because what spontaneously arises in each moment, the story of life, is a story of causality, is a story of time and space. We have to come to be able to hold the paradox and hold an explanation from both sides, a causal explanation and a more esoteric, mystical explanation. What we tend to often do is realize that we've lived our whole life assuming that cause and effect, time and space is an absolute reality. We've lived our whole life thinking that cause and effect is truth. Then we hear teachings that say, actually, cause and effect is illusory. is apparent, is an appearance, and we start to discount the reality of cause and effect. And that leads to fairly impressive, profound experiences. Experiences that demonstrate that life is actually far more mystical and much less like it seems on the surface. And what we then tend to do is we deny causality, which means we've flipped from seeing a coin, which is two-sided, we've flipped from seeing it only one side of it, let's say the causal, that life is about cause and effect, and I am this physical entity, and now we've flipped over and said, no, that cause and effect side doesn't exist, and there's just this spontaneous arising. But when we look at what the spontaneous arising is, we find that the story that has been spontaneously created is a story of time and space, a story of evolution, a story of cause and effect. And that means that the story will always present itself as if there was a cause for every effect. And if we don't acknowledge that, we miss a large aspect of what this creation is. So in spirituality, if we can come to explain something in both terms, and there will always be an explanation, a causal explanation. So a miracle, we might not understand the cause, but as we start to understand things more and more, there will be a cause, not a cause that we don't understand, but there will be a cause. We can come to understand the cause. Or we can just say there is no cause for miracles, it's something that just happened in the moment, spontaneous arising. So what I'm getting at is that in theory, an oak tree that looks like it's a 200-year-old oak tree could spontaneously arise in the next moment here, because the creation isn't ultimately a creation of cause and effect. The creation ultimately is a spontaneous creation, and so in the next moment, an oak tree could be there. But because this spontaneous creation has been created to be a story of cause and effect, it's unlikely for that to happen unless a time comes where the story starts to deviate from the rules in order to show us that it's not what it seems. So one day an apple might float past, and that wouldn't surprise me in principle because, well, it would surprise me, but I'd have my explanation as to why that can happen. But until life is ready to change from what it's been for all of time, a story of time and effect, that's not going to happen. So everything will be causally explained. But as long as together with the causal explanation, we hold the mystical explanation. So something like resonance and all of these things, I'm not choosing one or the other. I hold both together. And then you have a really nice answer for what this resonance is. It's really just your destiny to be here. And so life puts in a very magical feeling that ensures you get here. It can't happen any other way. If you're here, it's because the story of life was always going to have you here.
You mentioned about...
Just check that the button is on. Yeah, is the green light on?
Hello? Hello, is it okay?
Yes.
You mentioned about that how the concepts can be used, like they become a part of your system, and then spontaneously it can bring about a shift in the perception. When there is like the first category of suffering you explain, my question is, when it comes to the second category of suffering, where like worry, anxiety, insecurity, or jealousy, so how can one investigate into, say, anxiety or a sense of or fear or insecurity, and like I would like to ask you, like if you were in my mind, like if you were in me and I'm feeling all these things, let's take the example of what I told yesterday. Let's take the example of a girl, and there is all this mind games, like so much of fear, insecurity, whether she will come, whether she will go away with she will meet some other guy better than me, whether she will, or whether she will like me or not, or what should I do to attract her. So all these things, fear, insecurity, everything is. So how, if you could think through me, how would you investigate this entire thing, and how would you perceive it?
Yeah.
To let go of.
Let's not have me thinking through you, because there isn't a me that can think through you. There's just your biological makeup that will do thinking.
Yeah.
And so I'll talk about how.
Or say if it happens to you.
Yeah.
Then.
So the basis of what's being pointed at here, and so Buddha's, in summary, enlightenment is the end of suffering. The cause of suffering is desire. He's wrapped it up there. So what you're talking about is completely related to desire. And what does desire really mean? Desire means attachment to pleasure. Attachment to pleasure means the ingrained belief that what I am requires pleasure in order to be complete. That's what desire means, and attachment to pleasure means the same thing. An ingrained belief that my life depends on circumstance. Circumstances I want it, effectively pleasure. And the deepest pleasure we're looking for is love. So the deepest desire is the desire for love, which means we have a very strong attachment to love, because deep down we are convinced that my completeness is dependent on love. So, how do we bring about a shift? Rather, more precisely, how does a shift happen? A shift happens when life conditions us in such a way that thinking about the subject happens. We can call that contemplating. And as contemplation happens, insight happens, or conclusions are drawn. Usually we have contemplating, conclusions, and ultimately insight. Insight is the point where a conclusion gets finely enough tuned that it falls into place and is known to be true. And it's just an experience in the moment as part of the story of life. Everything destined to happen exactly the way it happens. So the shift happens when contemplating, especially in jnana yoga. This is jnana yoga, which is the path of wisdom, a path whereby change happens through the delivery, the exchange of concepts, wisdom, teachings, that become part of our system. Contemplation happens as a result, and then ignorance falls away. Ignorance falls away because under the light of awareness, with the guidance of wisdom concepts, the false beliefs, the lies effectively about who we are, can't remain indefinitely. If you question a lie long enough, it will be shown to be inaccurate. And that's effectively what this process of transformation is. It's not a process, this is the thing, we really have to see it's not a process that I do. Contemplation happens. Contemplation happens once the experience of the human being, including the experience of, let's say, suffering because of desire, and the experience of certain concepts, when they come together, then contemplation has to happen. Contemplation on that subject has to happen. Because we know that it's a problem, we can feel that it's uncomfortableness, and now the brain has been conditioned in such a way that it knows there's a potential solution. So thinking is going to happen. But let's recognize it's not any one thinking, it's thinking happening. Now, why I keep going back to this mechanical nature is because a large part of not knowing ourselves is identifying with things that we're not. We've taken the relative and identified them as truth. And when we identify with the relative as truth or absolute, the real absolute is unable to be seen, because attention is on the changing and the relative, but the attitude is that this is absolute. So the process here is to bring into focus the relative as relative, the mechanical as mechanical. And once that happens, then we start relating to the mechanical as mechanical, we start relating to the relative as relative, which means witnessing happens. When we don't see the mechanical as mechanical, the relative as relative, it means there's identification with them as truth. It means I identify with them as what I am. What I am is absolute. Right? What I am is the only thing in the manifestation that is true. What I am is the only thing that remains ever present and unchanging, regardless of circumstance. Everything else is always changing. So obviously I'm not speaking about the body. The body is always changing. I'm not speaking about the thoughts or the emotions or the feelings. They're always changing. What I am is the sense of existence and the awareness that is aware of every moment that comes and goes. An experience of the moment is not possible unless there is the same unchanging awareness there to be aware of the changing content. And synonymous with awareness is the sense of existence that is also ever present. I am. Not I am the body, or I am good or bad, or big or small, or 40 or 50, male or female, but just impersonal sense of existence, which we can start to feel and know as ourself. Awareness lands on itself, awareness lands on this sense of I am, only once all the relative components, which we have previously identified with, become seen as relative. And that's when awareness can then finally rest in itself. This is the process of neti-neti, not this, not that, pointing to everything that is ever changing and not what we are. So that last 5 minutes spiel was off topic a little bit, but very relevant to the ultimate topic. So the thinking is mechanical and will happen exactly the way it's destined to happen. So that means that we can start to witness thinking happening and see it as a process. And if that happens, a huge shift has happened, because the false idea of who we are is I am the thinker, I am the thoughts. And that becomes a huge cornerstone to the belief in personal doership. If I am the thinker, and I am the thinker of the thoughts, and thoughts precede actions, then obviously the actions are my actions because they were my thoughts. Right? So going back to the topic of desire, the investigation will happen, and the root of the investigation is to know from your experience that pleasure has never given you continuous unbroken peace of mind, which is really what we're looking for. And it requires us to start to investigate that and to use our experience to date. You've had a whole lifetime of receiving pleasure and finding that once you receive pleasure, you set up another set of expectations, because that pleasure hasn't delivered continuous unbroken peace of mind. So you can eat a nice piece of chocolate cake, and an hour later you're not going to be happy because of that chocolate cake. It's going to be pleasurable in that moment. So in my experience, as I mentioned yesterday, one thing that was very profound in hammering home this concept. So first, we spoke about what intellectual understandings is. An intellectual understanding is when the concept is put forward and it's understood intellectually. So yesterday there was a very great event that happened for me that demonstrated, and I can share with you the difference between intellectual understanding and the deepening of intellectual understanding. So it's much more than an intellectual understanding. So several years ago I was told that if you smile at a monkey and show them your teeth, they're going to take that as a sign of aggression. And I understood the concept intellectually. I thought, yes, that makes sense. And it locked away in my system somewhere, but I had forgotten about it, no big deal. And yesterday I was walking down to Virupaksha cave, and there was a little monkey, a small monkey, just looking at me, wanting to play, wasn't afraid or anything. I had like little glassy eyes, looked like a little human, and it was the sweetest thing I'd seen all day. And I just smiled at it. And as soon as I smiled at it, this monkey jumped back in horror and made a noise. And I realized everything inside of me was, appreciation and awe for this monkey. But as far as it was concerned, it saw my teeth and that was it. I was going to try and kill it. And its mother heard this yelp and she came rushing over, ready to attack. So that's a demonstration of how our intellectual understanding can go deeper to the point where we have no question, we've seen it in action, we've verified it for ourselves. And so one of the verifications for myself in regard to this question about my happiness is not to be found in pleasure came 20 years ago when I had set a financial objective for myself that I thought would take a couple of years to achieve. And through pure chance, an investment that I had made performed remarkably well. The shares went up 10, 20, 30-fold, I don't know what it was. And the financial objective I had set, which I thought would take 2 years or more to achieve, was achieved 3 weeks after I set it. And for about an hour I was excited, and then I realized I've just set another financial goal that would take another 2 years unless some other miraculous event happened. An hour after achieving the financial goal, that was it. It was no longer relevant, and another goal was set. And the thought occurred to me when I realized this, is this how I'm going to live my life? Because I could see that this could be a wheel that carries on till I'm 80 or 90. And if I lived my whole life like that, at the point where I'm going to die frustrated. Because each time I set a goal thinking it's going to deliver something substantial, effectively, I thought, once I get to that point, everything is okay. And when you actually get to that point, you find that nothing of the sort is the case, because straight away you set another goal that effectively says the same thing. Once I get there, it's going to be okay. And it's not going to be okay, and maybe we need to go through that process 10, 20, 100 times to realize that the first time it wasn't okay, and we thought, yeah, but that's just the first time, so the second one will be okay. And then the second time was the same, and it depends on how our destiny is set as to how long it's going to take us for us to realize that in principle, no matter what pleasure we receive, it's always just going to be pleasure. Some more intense than others, but they're still just pleasure. And once it really clicks, that means that the intellectual understanding has been recognized on a much deeper level. And that recognition, once it drops in deeply, has the effect of dissolving the opposite false belief. The false belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure. So the concept is telling you that your happiness is not going to be delivered through a girl liking you or disliking you or different sexual experiences. Pleasure, yes. Pain, also. None of these relationship things are guaranteed to be pleasure only. Far from it. But what I can guarantee you, based on my understanding that is not intellectual but actually experiential, whereby suffering isn't part of my life experience, is that pleasure of any sort is not the source of your happiness.
What if the desire is for a form of pleasure or a source of pleasure that seems like impossible to attain? Like it seems like it's too distant in future, or it seems like way too much difficult. and the belief is so strong that 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 this is what is really lacking. This experience, this particular pleasure, this particular source of pleasure is what is being lacked, and only that particular source of pleasure and that particular pleasure only can fulfill this lack. And if it is being lacked for many years, and it has developed, it has built up over many years, then how can something like that, because I understand your point, like you can go through the experiences and see for yourself like how much it is delivering actually, and you see one time, you see second time, you see like that maybe 40, 50, 100 times, and you see that every time it comes for some time, you feel
Precisely,
but it's
yeah.
gone then. But
So,
what...
Excuse me, can you turn the light on? Is that possible?
Just push on. Or, yeah.
And one more, I think. Yeah, and then you can turn the other. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
So...
Yeah. So you're saying, so what if the desire that I think I need is not something I'm going to be able to experience 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 times?
What if the desire is so difficult to attain, and the belief is so strong that only that particular source and that particular form is going to fulfill this lack, especially if the lack is being experienced for many years, because now this opportunity is not available that okay, I can experience it and see for myself that see how it's not what I'm...
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Pardon?
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how can it be in this case? It can be investigated, and what are some of the questions that can be used as a pointer to look at it, or other?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you've described is one of the mechanisms of the storyline that is put in place that does perpetuate suffering. Right? A desire that isn't satisfied, that is continued to be believed because of the fact that we haven't had the experiential proof that it doesn't deliver happiness, continues to be a belief. That is one of the ways that the story of life maintains suffering for extended periods of time, because that is what this story of life is. It's a story of forgetting ourselves, forgetting what it is that we truly are, and therefore coming up with false ideas of what we need. As a result of that forgetting happening, suffering is part of this story of life. And then at some point, not a point we control, but a point in the storyline, a remembering happens, and a waking up to our true nature, and then a falling away of these desires. It isn't, there's some good news here, it isn't a recipe for disaster. I was just joking. It is on the one hand, but there are some back doors to solving it. But they're not guaranteed, because as you're saying, this is so deeply ingrained. And one of the ways is to intellectually come to see that love and sexuality is pleasure, and that you've experienced other forms of pleasure and they haven't satisfied, and that the principle is that if they're pleasure, then they fit into the same category, and so even the pleasures you haven't experienced won't satisfy. And that's not guaranteed that it's going to work. The other, more significant, is to drop into being, to find a way of dropping into the essence of who we are. Because as we drop into the essence of who we are, we have experiential proof that what I am requires nothing in order to be complete. Right? So I'll repeat that. The other way is not to experience all pleasures and then realize that pleasure isn't going to deliver my happiness, but rather to drop into a place where we are happy, where we're happy right now. And that dropping into a place of being where instantaneously we know, oh, I am, and I'm complete, and I don't have these desires satisfied. I haven't had these, and I am. So the process of the Buddhist monk and some Buddhist practices of renunciation are aimed at exactly this, is that they strip all pleasures from the human experience, not all, but many. So you shave your head, you wear similar clothes, you sleep on a hard bed, you have simple food, cold showers, no sex, right? And one day the monk is walking in the forest, the sun shines through the trees, everything is perfect, and the dawning is a realization, the monk, I am. With no hair, no sex, no good food, cold showers, hard bed. I am. And at that point, when the realization becomes deeply ingrained, and that one realization of I am, which might be might not be enough to deeply ingrain this understanding that what I am, which is ever present, is always complete. The first time it happens might not be enough, because it comes and we can lose contact with it. But if at least we remember, I remember that it was all okay, regardless of circumstance, then there is now a basis to remember and to go for that movement back to start happening more regularly. And as it happens more regularly, we start getting more and more experiential proof that the essence of who I am doesn't require anything more to be complete, and that my peace and happiness stems from there.
So in connection to that, I want to understand what could be the need, is a desire, after having recognized our true nature as complete.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, yesterday I was thinking, or I don't know where, I know a non-duality teacher, a woman, who continued to give some satsang. And after 2-3 years of satsang, she fell in love with a follower, huh? And now she has a baby, and his husband is her husband is go with her for satsang and touring and playing guitar, etc. So my question is, what has driven this person in that desire or in that need to have someone, knowing that if she has recognized his true nature, she's complete.
Sure, great.
All right. What has, in the same way, what could be the difference between all this desire to fall in love, to have a relation, making love, have sex, or have a baby, and before recognizing our true nature and after recognizing our true nature?
Yeah, great.
What could be the difference, or the different approach of the organism in that way?
Okay, so for the purpose of answering the question, let's assume that the realization of true nature is complete, right? So that's the assumption. That means that there is no desire in the sense of the word desire that we've been using it, which means there is no attachment to pleasure. But the fact that there is no attachment to pleasure doesn't mean that life is now going to be devoid of pleasure. It means we'll now interact with pleasure in a way that understands that pleasure is pleasurable, and it's inevitably part of the flow of life, that the flow of life is always going to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others. And so with a realization of who we are, life carries on. Life as this human being continues to be lived, and so it will be lived according to destiny, according to the story of life, which means in each moment the person who has a clear understanding of what a person is, meaning a connection to source, because ultimately the realization is that what I am is not what I thought I was. I thought I was this separate independent entity, a body that has a consciousness and is not connected to anything else. And the realization of self is that actually what I am is a combination of a biological instrument, which is in a sense a vehicle for experience, a vehicle that has a destiny. And not only the vehicle, but I am the impersonal consciousness of Source linked to this vehicle and functioning through it as personal consciousness. And so the realization is that I am always connected to Source. It is Source that is functioning through me, and once it links to the body and functions out of the body, it's Source as personal consciousness. So impersonal consciousness links to the body. The point where it links to the body is the point of I am, and from that point it flows through the body. The body has personality, and the combination of the consciousness and the body is the expression of the human being. So that movement of life is going to carry on. And so my explanation is that she does that because that's what's destined to happen. The engaging in family and children and love and intimacy is done from a point of view of non-attachment, meaning that it is pleasure, but I know when it passes. That doesn't mean that a part of me has been ripped apart or lost. And practically speaking, if you want to know what mechanism motivates a movement forward, because we now say that the motivation which is based on a belief that I need pleasure, that's fallen away. So now we need another motivating explanation on a causal level. We've got the explanation on a spontaneous God's will story of life level, but on a causal level, we often underestimate that what's left is the biological makeup of the body, which includes its biological preferences. And therefore, if a platter of food comes around and there are 5 items on it, and one item is my very favorite, in that moment, because our preferences are always changing, but in one moment I look at the 5 items and one of them is going to stand out as my favorite. And the movement is going to be towards the favorite and away from the one that I dislike. And so the body is always going to have its biological preferences. And so from the point where attachment has fallen away, the movement is dictated by the body's biological preferences. However, the attitude now is an attitude which no longer feels that the biological preferences absolutely have to be delivered. So if I go to take my favorite piece of food and someone else grabs it before I get it, it's accepted that it was my destiny not to have that pleasure in the moment, accepted that it was the destiny of the other to take my pleasure away from me, and their destiny to have the pleasure or pain of that food item, because it might have been really bad, might have been prepared with rotten eggs. And then I can be fortunate, consider myself fortunate I didn't have it. But because I don't know that it's been incorrectly prepared, I assume that my pleasure has not been delivered, but I see it all as destiny, and I see that it was destined for that person to deliver the pain to me, or at least the absence of pleasure, and so I don't hate them.
So that is the point of view of the person who recognizes his own nature. So for the other one who are not recognize their own nature, then he will feel a lack or something needed to overcome this lack.
Sure.
To feel complete.
Yeah. So the basis of the lack, I have this theory concept that ultimately it's a retake on the notion of original sin, and you might be glad to know it's a complete retake of it, because I don't attribute the same meaning of original sin that religion has put on it. To me, original sin, sin in Latin comes from the word error. So sin really means error. Original error is what all human beings are born with, at least the seed of original error. And the seed flowers at about the age of 2.5 or 3 when the ego forms. the ego is identification with name and form. But identification with name and form is not the problem. Ramana was identified with name and form. Jesus was identified with name and form. Buddha was identified with name and form. That means that Ramana didn't feel like he was the chair or the table. He didn't feel like he was the person sitting in front of him. Ramana, and so I'm speaking definitively, I'm quite sure, but I don't take it as truth. I know it's a relative concept, it could be wrong. I don't know Ramana's experience, but I know what an experience of freedom is, and I can assure you that identification with name and form is present, and it's not what causes the problem. And so this point is often misunderstood. People are waiting for the dissolving of identification with name and form, which is waiting for something that's not going to happen in my estimation. So identification with name and form simply means that there is a feeling that I am this body and not the tripod or the table. And so when someone called Rama's name and said, "Excuse me, can you help me with this problem?" he would turn to them and say, "Sure, what's your question?" And so the fact that he responded to name and the form responded means that there was identification with name and form. That happens at about the age 2.5 or 3, where a child stops referring to themselves as third person and starts calling themselves me, or this is mine. The original sin then kicks in. So it's there as a seed, and it flowers at about the same time as this identification with name and form, and that is the sense of personal doership, the belief in personal doership, which is the based on the experience that I am this name and form. Then certain conclusions, which are part of our up-to-date conditioning, get put in place, because it feels like I am the doer, right? And so the child then, as well as having the ego, and the ego is this identification with name and form, and the ego never dissolves. So we are the ego, and Ramana was the ego. The difference is you can have an ego with the sense of personal doership, or an ego where the sense of personal doership has been dissolved. Where the sense of personal doership has been dissolved, a realization of our connection to source is there. And when the belief in personal doership remains in place, it creates a sense of separation. It creates a sense that I am this entity, and that there is no source functioning through me. What's this source functioning through me? I am the one that chooses this and thinks this and does that. And the dissolving of the sense of personal doership means the recognition of our connection to source, but still living life from the point of view of feeling like this particular individual, but knowing that ultimately the essence of the human being is consciousness, formless being, that when the story of Roger dies, when the vehicle dies, the biological instrument dies and is burnt or buried, that Roger dies with the vehicle. The personality is largely part of the vehicle, that Roger will not exist once the vehicle is dead. But the source that is functioning through it remains untouched. And so knowing that what I am in essence, the truth, the absolute essence of what I am, is not the mechanical aspect. So connecting to that I am means I know what I am in truth, something that wasn't born and won't die. But I live this life as the human being, which is the combination of the two, but knowing when life comes to an end, I can die peacefully, knowing that throughout life I've done in each moment what I feel like doing, with no regret about what I did in the past and no expectations in the future. So it can die peacefully knowing that the story of Roger has come to an end, but that's not an ultimate assault on who I am. And so from that perspective, we can live life where life delivers pain, and pain is like a mini death. If we're not afraid of the ultimate death, then pain is going to be received in the same way. That pain is, sure, an attack on the biological preference, if we want to look at it that way, but it's never an attack on anything deeper than that. So I think your question was, how does the individual that isn't aware of their true nature act, they act from this place of this original sin, which is flowered, which means from the sense of personal doership, which means a disconnection from source, which means the essence of who they are is not being recognized. And essentially there's an identification with being the physical, being the thoughts and the emotions, and convinced that I am the one that has to make life happen, and that my happiness and my completeness is dependent on pleasure. And therefore, if someone takes my food, which is my pleasure, they're taking away my happiness, and I have to hate them because they have attacked who I am, who I believe I am. And that is the competition and anonymity that happens in life. And it's our unhappiness. It's what keeps us disconnected, or keeps us unaware of our connection to Source.
This is has taken shape from these few days, and it's on this subject, and also refers to when you use the word personal consciousness, which is a bit problematic, that thing. So if I make a comparison with this, we could say the sun is really shining. It produces light. The moon, we all know, as scientifically educated, does not produce light, but it is quite possible to believe that. You walk in the night and you see the moon is shining. So somebody said, "Oh, nice moonlight," and then I say, "Actually, it's sunlight." So would you say this could be a good enough comparison with this? I say, I am thinking, I am doing, and somebody says, no, actually, it's source, and so there is a reflection in the body mind, like compared to the moon then, and so the awakening then is real for the moon, so to speak, to realize that it is moonlight. You could call it moonlight. Mm-hmm. It is light coming from the moon.
Yes,
but it is.
That's exactly
sunlight,
right. Perfect.
And then you could say this personal consciousness then is moonlight. In this sense, I'm trying to this connection.
Yep.
But to me, then it is sunlight.
Yeah, but there's
do you see what
exactly why I'm happy with the explanation is because you said it is moonlight, right? It's both. You're not picking. So it's moonlight, but now we know what the source of moonlight is. But let's not forget it's moonlight, but it's sunlight. So we know that moonlight is sunlight, but we're not calling moonlight sunlight. But we know what moonlight is. So there is personal consciousness. So because moonlight is different to sunlight, but it is sunlight, but it's sunlight through a certain filter, let's say. It's sunlight in a reflected form. So it isn't sunlight, but it is sunlight. And it is moonlight, but it isn't moonlight. So we have to say there is personal consciousness. If someone says, well, if personal consciousness is really impersonal consciousness, then there's no personal consciousness, there's only impersonal consciousness. Right? So your analogy is the best I've heard. As long as we say there is moonlight, which is what you said.
Yeah, and the point of making it is to hear you say that, and that means that when you say there is such a thing as personal consciousness, you mean precisely this kind of thing, nothing more than that, and nothing less.
Yes. So the analogy I have used, which I think Ramesh used to use it, is the analogy of appliances in the home. You have 10 different appliances in the home. They're all uniquely designed, and there is one impersonal electricity that plugs into all of the appliances. And what comes out of the appliance is the personal consciousness, let's say, or the personal form of energy. So heat out of the heater, movement out of the fan, cold air out of the fridge. All of those are the personal expression or the differentiated expression of the one undifferentiated consciousness. Or, sorry, I'm mixing up the analogies. What comes out of the appliance is the differentiated energy that essentially is the one undifferentiated energy or electricity. But once it goes through the filter of the appliance, it is changed. And so we can ultimately say that heat ultimately is electricity or energy. But if we're going to be practical about it, we don't call a house a pile of bricks. You know, we call a house, not a pile of bricks. And so we will call heat, not energy. And so we call personal consciousness because in practice it is a personal expression of source. But we know that the source of the personal consciousness is the undifferentiated source. And so another analogy is white light going through a red filter, let's say, and what comes out is red light. Now, is the red light or is it white light? So they're all very good analogies for the same thing. Is we could say that the red light is white light, but it's red light as well as white light.
There's always a risk, of course, that one tries to see too much in the analogy. But the reason I prefer the moon to the electrical things is that moonlight is also light, like sunlight. But you were talking about cold and heat and stuff that are not electricity. So,
yeah,
then it becomes...
yeah, but in the human, it's much more like the transformation that happens in the appliance. Because in the human, the personal consciousness is heavily affected by all of the conditioning of the body. So the personal consciousness includes, let's say, the personality and all of the very differentiated aspects that come after the impersonal flows through the body. So there is quite a differentiation between impersonal consciousness and personal consciousness.
Okay, that's interesting, but let's leave this now, perhaps.
I won't leave it. So is personal consciousness then this body, these thoughts, these feelings, or is impersonal consciousness awareness?
Sorry, is the personal consciousness, you said?
Yeah.
Is it the body and the feelings?
Yeah. Or is it awareness or being?
So when we drop into a state of meditation, let's say, that is very deep, and the body experience falls away, and what we're left with is awareness of nothing, let's say, in a deep meditation, but there's still the sense of awareness and the sense of being. We could say that that is the most impersonal expression of personal consciousness. Or you could say that's impersonal consciousness. It becomes a moot point. And when we come out of meditation into this experience, then we would say that this experience is personal consciousness experience. So that's the difference between impersonal and personal, is that in the impersonal, it's got very little personal characteristics to it. And in the personal, it's got personal characteristics. And so it's a combination of the body and the impersonal awareness. And the impersonal consciousness really is it's neither the body and the impersonal, it's just the output, the feeling, I am. It's neither the body or the impersonal consciousness, but the end result. So at the point where I said we come out of the meditation and we feel, Roger is here. That feeling of Roger in whatever form it takes in that moment. So there could be Roger that's got a sense of excitement, let's say. That feeling is the personal consciousness. And in another moment there won't be excitement. There'll be something, Roger feeling tired, let's say, or whatever. So it's the feeling is the personal consciousness. Oh yes.
So, can you suggest like some of the questions or some of the pointers, specific questions that we can use, or can you give some example, real life example, that when we go from the satsang back to our home, that we can use to very specifically investigate any particular situation? Or because all you're saying is, I understand all that, but can you suggest some questions or some specific questions or pointers, and give one example, if possible, of how it can be used in our day-to-day life to investigate really into the heart of thought?
Yeah. So that's an important point. It's how it can be used to investigate, not how it can be used to solve the problem. You know, if you say, how can I use it to solve the problem? We've become attached to outcomes. It's the doer that is saying, tell me how I can do this, right? And so this is the point that Ramesh used to make time and time again, is he said, we've just spoken for an hour and a half about non-doership, and then the question that is asked is, so tell me, how do I do da-da-da? Which he wasn't being, he'd understand why this happened. This is destiny. This is the doership is so ingrained in us. But nonetheless, it's a good question as long as we understand that there isn't anyone doing it. It's life happening because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, or the story of life, unfolding exactly as it's dictated to unfold. So the story of life unfolding exactly as it's dictated to unfold means that a leaf falls off a tree at exactly the moment it's destined to fall off, and follows the path to the ground exactly as it follows to the ground. Couldn't happen any other way. And this is a realization that can be verified through very many different explanations. The one that for me is most substantial, but it is very much based on profound realization, but the one that's most substantial is to realize that no experience exists in the absence of awareness, that experience is completely dependent on awareness being present, that if we move our head, which is synonymous with moving awareness, the objects that were previously there do not exist in the experience, and it's only these objects that exist in the experience. And as awareness shifts, now, in my experience, an object that previously existed, several objects that previously existed, do not exist. So experience is completely dependent on awareness and is independent on awareness, which means that nothing exists separate from awareness, in my experience. And that's where the saying, which is often not understood, but points at this fact, and it's hugely profound at demonstrating the nature of life, which is completely opposite to how what we assume life is. And that is that if a tree falls in a forest and there is no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? And in that analogy or saying, someone or no one there to hear it represents consciousness. So what it's saying is, if there is no consciousness present to be aware of the tree falling, does the tree make a sound? And the answer is not yes or no. The answer is another question. Does the tree exist? Does the forest exist? Does the tree exist to fall? Does the ground exist for the tree to fall on? So what it's really pointing at is that life is not what we think. Life is not an objective reality that is there all the time and then we just come and see it. It's pointing at the fact that life is not at all what it seems. It's an experience arising in consciousness. The body is actually part of the experience, and there is an awareness that is aware of the experience that arises and is continually collapsing and re-arising in such a way that creates the impression of an objective reality which the body moves through. It's like a cartoon. that is made up of millions of frames that arise and fall to create the impression of time and space, to create the impression of a separate individual doer that is making things happen. The realization that that's not the nature of life, that everything arises inside what I am as formless awareness, means that the notion of doership is known to be a complete fallacy. It is a dream. It's known that the character in the dream can only do what the dreamer of the dream dictates the character does. The character can't jump out of the dream. The character can't say, hey, hang on, I'm going to do what I want. If the character asks the shopkeeper for a packet of cigarettes, the character in the dream is asking for a packet of cigarettes because the dream, which spontaneously arose out of nothing, the whole dream universe that arose, is a story, a dream. And the character in the dream is acting and speaking and feeling exactly as the dream is designed for them to act, feel. So from that point of view, there's no question of life being anything but a predetermined experience from the perspective of the character. I'm not sure what the point of all of that was, because I went off track. So you wanted to...
Repeat the question?
You wanted to know practical questions you can ask yourself in order to investigate things that are useful. So in your particular case that you brought up, it's specific to attachment to certain pleasures. But suffering in general is based on more than that. Usually it's the guilt and the blame and the pride as well. And so the exercise that Ramesh would share, and it was a very, very good one when someone asks for a practice, he said, actually, there is nothing for you to do. There is no practice for you to do. If you're practicing, you're deep down saying, I need to achieve something, I need to get somewhere, and it's the doer that wants to practice. But nonetheless, as we see life, it seems that this story unfolds through contemplation. And so he said, if there is something to do, then sit quietly at the end of the day, look at things that have happened through the day and pick one that you are convinced is your action, your doing, and then investigate that. Investigate what you're convinced is your doing, and upon investigation you'll find that what you think is your doing was something that happened at a particular point in time based on circumstance being a particular way, circumstance not being the way you chose it to be or you controlled. You then saw, smelt, tasted, heard, or touched something that wasn't in your control, determined by circumstance. So a bird flies across the screen, you saw that, and a thought arises that, oh, I'm going to go and get my camera to take a photo of that bird. The thought arises as a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, in response to something you've seen which you weren't in control of. Your movement to go and get your camera was inspired by this thought that happened because of these factors. And so what we think is my doing on investigation turns out to be a series of happenings that were destined to happen according to factors that you weren't in control of. And the more and more we investigate this time and time again, we'll always find that whatever I think is my doing is actually a happening. So that investigation tends to dissolve the ingrained belief that doesn't recognize the mechanics of life, as I've just explained. And so that's a handy way of spending some time each day. When it comes down to attachment to pleasure, the explanation I gave earlier, which is simply to observe for yourself, is pleasure giving me continuous unbroken happiness, or is pleasure pleasure? Is pleasure transient, and therefore by recognizing that pleasure is transient, is it a conclusion I can draw that it's not going to give me continuous unbroken happiness regardless of circumstance, given that circumstance often is going to be pain. The other practice is dropping into being, drop into I am, where in that moment you know yourself to be complete and not require anything. And that is Nisargadatta's abide in I am, and the way I related to abide in I am was to recognize that the obsessive thinking that we have is based on the belief that I need pleasure in the moment in order to be complete. Worry and is based on the same belief but in a different form. Guilt and blame and expectation of, wanting a business and trying to strategize about how we're going to get something obsessively, where it's an obsessive thinking. So all of these forms of obsessive thinking we come to know as suffering. We come to know that it's based on error, an error of what we are and what we need. And so when awareness lands on this obsessive thinking having been happening for 10, 15 minutes, 3 hours in a day, at that point, a thought might arise, part of your up-to-date conditioning. This is obsessive thinking that I, at some level, believe to be helpful for my happiness. But now I know that actually when I look at it, it's either guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation, and it's uncomfortableness, it's my unhappiness. So awareness lands on this, and in that moment it can cut it off, because it's known to be not helpful. And in cutting it off, for a moment we can just drop into being, where thinking stops. But at first thinking stops for about half a second. And without us even knowing, the momentum of that thinking drags us back into thinking, and it can be 10 minutes before we've realized, wow, I wonder how long I was in being for, because bang, I was very quickly dragged out of it. But that's okay, because as soon as we realize, be it 10 minutes later, we can have a thought that comes up, and then the thought that comes up can be this one, I am. That can be the thought that just effectively, I am summarizes, I know that this thinking is not helpful, it's my suffering. And we summarize it to I am. And the thought I am cuts off the thinking, and we drop into being. And that's something you can practice 20, 30, 40, 50 times a day without it breaking. You can be walking through the supermarket and do it. You don't need to stop. Although when you drop into I am, we tend to stop and just be. And then you have your own proof.
Pardon?
Then you start getting your own proof that there is a field of being that is outside of thinking, where I know myself to be complete. And that's what Rumi's poem about a field. I'll meet you there.
And I feel like, really, like I asked you yesterday, like even when it's very peaceful and still some girl comes and immediately the desire is some nice girl comes and the desire starts and the restlessness and everything, despite having a peaceful past few hours before. But I still am not clear, like even though there is a peace, there is still some discomfort going on. Like it's not 100% peace.
Sure, because
So
the belief is very much still in place.
So my question is, like, if there is not even an iota of his pain, then is there a possibility for desire still, or for the pleasure? Means what I want to ask is that is the desire for pleasure arising, the very reason for the arising for the desire of pleasure is the pain? Is the pain the source of the desire for pleasure?
Not pain. We're talking about suffering, right? Or not pain?
I don't know how suffering or pain.
Yeah. The desire, where we believe we need it, creates an uncomfortableness inside of us. Right? That's suffering. And out of that suffering comes what we are told is the solution. So out of the suffering, the solution is assumed to be the deliverance of what we think is missing. So desire stems from the suffering, and the suffering stems from the false belief of who we are and what we need. So that's why satisfying the pleasure seems like a solution, because temporarily it will mean the suffering is stops. But invariably, if the belief remains in place, it's going to arise again as soon as the pleasure is not available. So the solution is not to go around trying to get our desires fulfilled all the time. That's addiction. The solution is to undo the root of the desire. And the root of the desire is an ingrained belief that life put in place that says what you are requires pleasure in order to be complete. Now, the fact is that another way of dealing with this is to recognize that suffering is a huge part of this life experience, and that in each moment we are destined to suffer. Well, not in each moment, but in many moments in life we're destined to suffer, and that there aren't any solutions to it. In fact, the solution to suffering is to accept it. Now, accept it, what does accept it mean? We can't say, oh, I accept. You can't do accepting. Accepting is something that happens once we firstly see the inevitability of things, which means if suffering is there, there's an understanding inside of us that it's my destiny for suffering to be here, and that the doership in me wants to get rid of it, which is more suffering. So if that's realized, we can surrender to the suffering that's there. Not as a way of cheating the system and say, if I surrender, then the suffering will go. Let's say the suffering's not going to go, but surrender to it, which means you're not going to intensify your suffering by resisting it. And surrendering to suffering, ironically, it's very strange, really, is the best solution to suffering. It is the one. It's by far the thing that makes suffering fall away more, because it's wisdom. It requires wisdom in order to surrender to suffering. Wisdom that says, I'm not the doer, I'm not in control, and in some moments I'm destined to suffer. Then the other realization is that what I am is actually prior to even the suffering. And there can be a grounding in being again, which further has the potential. But if we try to do these as strategies, it's the doer doing them. So really what needs to happen is the understanding needs to become really ingrained. Life is doing that. And at first, inevitably, the doer is going to try and do it, and awareness will land on the suffering that inevitably comes from that. And then we click. And who clicks? It's the working mind that recognizes this and says, me trying to do this is actually adding more insult to injury. So we relax. All of that's happening. It's really, you have to see your thoughts arise automatically based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Something watches this whole process.